There was nothing remarkable about the morning Eli Harper decided not to rush. The alarm rang at 6:30, as it always did. The gray light slipped through the thin curtains of his small apartment, brushing the edges of familiar furniture. The worn armchair by the window, the coffee table with a chipped corner, the bookshelf that held more dust than stories. Everything waited for him the way it always had. Predictable. Quiet. Almost kind. Eli lay still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the distant sound of traffic beginning to swell. Somewhere below, a delivery truck groaned to a stop. Life warming up, life going on. He turned the alarm off, but didn't get up. For years, his mornings had followed a clean, efficient script. Shower. Coffee. Toast today. His body refused the rhythm. It wasn't sadness that held him there. Not exactly. It was something softer and heavier at the same time. A quiet pressure behind the ribs, like a truth waiting for permission. Eli stared at the ceiling fan, watching its blades cut slow circles through the air. He tried to remember when the apartment had begun to feel less like a place he lived and more like a place he passed through. A stopover B. He sat up eventually, feet touch in the bathroom mirror. His face looked unchanged. 38 years old. The Coughley M. Ely worked as a he. Dre's something inside him whispered, "Not today." He ignored it. Always. The commute was familiar enough that he barely registered at the bus stop. Eli took a seat by the window. As buildings slid past, he felt an odd detachment, like he was watching a film of someone else's routine. He tried to remember the last time he had felt excited about anything beyond the relief of finishing a task. At a red light, he looked away. The paperwork waited on his desk. Reports, half finished. He sat down, opened a file, and stared at the screen. The words blurred together. His phone vibrated a message from his sister, Mara. Dad's appointment got moved up. Tomorrow morning. Eli closed his eyes. Their father had been declining quietly for years, nothing dramatic. Just the slow accumulation. Eli typed back. "Oh, come." He paused, then added, "Of course." He set the phone face down on the desk. For the rest of the morning, he moved through his tasks mechanically, like someone follow at lunch. Instead of eating at his desk, Eli stepped outside. The air was cool. The sky stretched pale and wide above the buildings. He walked without a destination, letting his feet choose. He found himself in a small park. Eli sat. For the first time in months, maybe longer, he allowed. He felt the weight of exhaustion as the afternoon something had begun, and he didn't yet know whether to resist it or finally listen. Eli returned to the office later than he intended. No one noticed, or if they did, no one said anything. The building absorbed him back into its neutral hum, the quiet agreement that time could be lost as long as results appeared eventually. He sat at his desk and reopened the report he had abandoned earlier. The words were still there, waiting patiently, unchanged. That constancy irritated him more than it should have. He typed a few sentences, deleted them, typed again. The cursor blinked, persistent and judgment-free. By the end of the day, he had finished what was required a always deed. On the bus ride home, the city looked different. Not new, just sharper, more present. He noticed the uneven rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk, the way shop lights flickered on one by one, the tired slump of shoulders reflected in the glass. It felt as if a thin veil had been lifted, revealing the quiet fatigue everyone carried. At his stop, Eli hesitated before stepping off, then did something unfamiliar. Instead of heading straight home, he walked. He followed streets without checking directions, turning when something caught his attention: a bookstore with a handwritten sign in the window, a bakery closing for the night, the sound of someone practicing piano behind an open window. Each small detail pulled him forward, gently but insistently. He ended up at a corner cafe he hadn't visited in years. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and old wood. A few people sat scattered at tables, absorbed in books or their phones. The place hadn't changed much, and that steadiness felt oddly comforting. Eli ordered a black coffee and took a seat near the back. As he waited, he noticed a woman at the counter, arguing softly with the barista, not angry, just precise. She gestured toward a notebook on the counter, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she turned, she caught Eli watching and gave a brief, apologetic smile. He looked Hawaii, embarrassed at being seen. The barista called his name. Ely took the cup and returned to his table. He didn't drink right away. He just sat, listening to the muted conversations, the clink of cups, the low music playing overhead. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Mara. He's nervous, pretending yes not. Ely typed, I'll be there early. This time, he didn't add anything else. He stared at the coffee until it cooled. His reflection trembled slightly on the surface, distorted by the faint ripples. He wondered when he had started treating his own life with the same detached professionalism he brought to his work. Evaluate, document, move on. The woman from the counter passed by his table on her way out. She hesitated, then stopped. Sorry to bother you, she said, holding up the notebook, but you look like someone who knows how to notice things. Does this place feel louder than usual to you? Or is it just me? Ely blinked, surprised. He glanced around, listening. No, it feels about the same. She nodded, thoughtful. Then it's me. She laughed quietly, more at herself than the situation. I'm Claire, she added, as if introducing herself for the most natural continuation of the moment. Ela, he replied. They stood there for a second longer than necessary, suspended in an awkward, gentle pause. Well, Claire said finally, have a good night. You too. She left, the bell above the door chiming softly behind her. Ely sat back, unsettled by how much that brief interaction lingered. It hadn't meant anything, and yet it had. At home, the apartment felt smaller than it had that morning. The silence pressed closer. Ela left the lights off and stood by the window, watching the city glow below. He thought about his father, about the careful way the doctor spoke now, choosing words that avoided certainty, about the unspoken understanding that time, once assumed abundant, had begun to contract. He thought about the park, the fountain, the feeling of sitting without purpose. For the first time in years, Ely allowed himself to imagine the possibility that his life, functional, respectable, might be asking for something different. Not more, not better, just truer. He went to bed later than usual. When he lay down, he didn't reach for his phone. He stared into the dark, letting thoughts surface and drift without forcing them away. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, a realization settled quietly into place. Nothing had gone wrong, but something had been waiting, and tomorrow, whether he was ready or not, it would ask him to respond. Ely woke before his alarm. The room was still dark, the city outside barely breathing. For a moment, he lay there, disoriented, unsure why his body had decided sleep was finished. Then the previous night returned to him in fragments de café. The quiet laugh, the way the word truer had echoed in his mind long after he closed his eyes. He sat up slowly. Nothing in his life had changed overnight. The same apartment, the same job waiting, the same responsibilities arranged neatly ahead of him. And yet, an unfamiliar tension pulled at his chest, like a question that refused to stay silent. At the hospital later that morning, the corridor smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. Ely walked beside Mara in silence, both of them carrying thoughts they hadn't yet found language for. Their father was awake when they entered. "You're early?" he said, voice thin but steady. "Couldn't sleep?" Ely replied. Their father smiled faintly. "That makes three of us." They talked about nothing important at first. Weather, news, headlines. A neighbor from years ago, who had apparently read. The conversation moved carefully around the truth. Like furniture pushed against a wall no one wanted to acknowledge. Eventually, the doctor came in. He spoke calmly, professionally. The kind of tone designed to soften reality without altering it. Progress was uncertain. Options were limited. Time no. One said the word directly, but it hovered between sentences, heavy and undeniable. Ely nodded, where appropriate, asked one or two practical questions, took mental notes he didn't want to remember. When it was over, Mara went to speak with a nurse. Ely stayed behind. His father watched him for a long moment. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I said." Ely exhaled. Sat down. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." he admitted quietly. His father studied him, eyes sharp despite the weakness in his body. Most people don't, he said. They just get good at pretending they do. Eli laughed softly, then stopped. Did you ever feel like you waited too long? To do what? To live differently. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memories, regrets, choices made and unmade. Yes, his father said finally. And no, Eli frowned. I waited too long to stop being afraid. His father continued, but I didn't wait too long to love you and your sister. Some things matter more than timing. Eli swallowed. When he left the hospital, he didn't go to work. Instead, he walked. He didn't have a destination in mind, only a vague instinct pulling him forward. The city unfolded around him, familiar yet altered by the weight he carried. Without fully realizing how, he found himself back at the cafe. Claire was there. She sat at a corner table. Notebook, open pen moving rapidly across the page. Her hair was pulled back today, her posture focused, almost intense. Eli hesitated, then approached. Does it feel louder today? Asked. She looked up startled, then smiled. A little, but in a good way. Mind if I sit? She gestured to the chair across from her. Please. They talked cautiously at first, about nothing, about everything. She told him she was a freelance editor, constantly between projects, always unsure where stability ended and stagnation began. He told her about his job, his father, the sense that his life had been arranged by someone else long ago and he'd simply followed the plan. You don't seem unhappy, she said after a while. I'm not, he replied. I just don't feel awake. Claire nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Sometimes, she said, comfort is the most convincing illusion. That sentence stayed with him. They talked until the cafe filled and emptied again, time slipping unnoticed between cups of coffee and half-finished thoughts. When they finally stood to leave, Eli felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. Outside, the light had shifted. Afternoon leaning toward evening. Same time, tomorrow? Claire asked, half smiling. Eli surprised himself by answering without hesitation. Yes. As he walked home, his phone buzzed. A message from his manager. We need to talk about your availability. Eli stared at the screen. For once, he didn't feel the immediate urge to respond. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept walking, aware suddenly sharply that the careful balance of his life was beginning to tilt, and that whether he resisted or not, something was already moving. The conversation with his manager happened the next morning. Eli had expected tension, maybe disappointment. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the words restructuring and temporary adjustments appeared, wrapped in polite corporate language that pretended not to mean what it clearly did. We've noticed you've seemed distracted lately, his manager said, fingers folded neatly on the desk. We need people who are fully present. Eli nodded. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself. Somewhere inside, a quiet understanding settled in. This was not a moment to fight. It was a moment to see clearly. By the time he left the building, the decision had already been made by the company. Perhaps, but also by him. The walk home felt heavier than usual. Every street looked the same, yet nothing felt stable. He wondered how long a life could remain unchanged before the body and mind began to rebel against it. At the hospital that afternoon, Mara was pacing. They moved his tests earlier, she said. He's tired. Their father slept when they entered the room, breath shallow but steady. Eli sat beside the bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, suddenly aware of how fragile even the strongest presences could become. Later, in the hallway, the doctor spoke quietly. We should prepare for the possibility that he may not improve, she said. Mara covered her mouth. Eli felt the words land somewhere deep, not sharp, but heavy like a truth that had been approaching for a long time. That evening, Eli didn't go home right away. He went to the cafe. Claire was already there. She noticed his expression immediately. That kind of day? He nodded, sat down. For a long moment, he said nothing. I think I'm losing the version of my life I thought was guaranteed, he said finally. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it. "That happens," she said softly, usually right before something honest begins. He looked at her, searching her face for certainty he knew she couldn't offer. "Are you ever afraid of choosing wrong?" he asked. "All the time," she replied, "but I'm more afraid of choosing nothing." They sat with that. Outside, rain began to fall, light at first, then steady. The cafe windows blurred, the world beyond them dissolving into motion and shadow. "I've spent years telling myself I had time," Eli said. "Time to change. Time to risk. Time to feel." Claire closed her notebook. "Time isn't something we have," she said. "It's something that happens to us." When he walked her to the bus stop later, neither of them rushed to say goodbye. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like," he admitted. Then, after a pause, "But I hope so." She smiled, not brightly, honestly. That night, Eli sat alone in his apartment. Lights off, city noise filtering in through the window. He replayed the day in fragments: the meeting, the hospital, the cafe, the rain. For the first time in years, his future felt undefined. And for the first time, that didn't terrify him. His phone vibrated again. A message from Mara. "Dad asked about you. He wants you to come early tomorrow." Ely typed back, "I will." Then hesitated. A second message appeared. From Claire, "Thank you for tonight." He stared at the screen longer than necessary. In the silence of the apartment, Eli realized something quietly unsettling. The life he had built to keep himself safe was no longer enough to keep him alive. And once you understood that, there was no returning to the comfort of not knowing. Ilya arrived at the hospital before sunrise. The corridors were quieter than usual. The lights dimmed, as if the building itself understood that mornings like this required gentleness. He paused outside his father's room, hand resting on the doorframe, steadying himself before going in. His father was awake. "You came early," he said, voice weak but alert. "You asked me to." A faint smile crossed his father's face. "I hoped you would." They sat together without speaking for a while. Outside the window, the city slowly began to wake, cars appearing one by one, the sky shifting from deep blue to pale gray. "I've been thinking," his father said eventually. "About you?" Eli nodded, heart tightening. "I never worried about whether you'd be successful," his father continued. "I worried about whether you'd be honest with yourself." Eli looked down at his hands. "I thought I was being responsible. Sometimes responsibility is just fear wearing a respectable coat." The words landed softly, but they stayed. "I stayed at my job because it was safe," Eli admitted. "I stayed quiet because it was easier. I told myself I was doing the right thing. And now I feel like I'm watching my life from a distance." His father reached for his hand, grip surprisingly firm. "You don't get many moments where you can still choose," he said. "When they come, they feel uncomfortable. They shake things. That's how you know they're real." Eli swallowed hard. Later that morning, Mara pulled him aside. "The doctor says we should prepare," she whispered. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon." Eli nodded. He had no words left to offer comfort. They had both reached the edge of what language could do. After leaving the hospital, Eli didn't go home. He walked. Through streets he had passed 1,000 times without noticing. Past shops he had never entered. Faces he'd never seen, each carrying their own invisible weight. He ended up at the cafe again, though it was still early. Claire wasn't there. For a brief, irrational moment, disappointment flared. Then he reminded himself that no one owed him constancy. He ordered coffee and sat alone, staring at the empty chair across from him. What would it mean, he wondered, to build a life that felt true rather than merely acceptable? His phone buzzed. An email from his manager. "We need a final answer regarding your position by the end of the week." Eli read it twice. This time, instead of anxiety, he felt clarity. That afternoon, Claire texted him. "Are you okay?" He hesitated, then replied honestly, "I don't know, but I think I'm closer." They met later, walking instead of sitting. The city felt different and motionless, like a backdrop, more like a participant. "I'm afraid," Eli said as they crossed a quiet bridge, "of choosing something I can't undo." Claire leaned against the railing, watching the water below. "Every choice closes one door," she said, "but not choosing closes all of them." He looked at her. Reality looked at the calm in her eyes, the subtle sadness that suggested she, too, had stood at similar crossroads. "Why are you here?" he asked suddenly. She considered the question. "Because I needed to stop running," she said, "and this city is quiet enough to hear myself think." That night, Eli sat at his desk, the resignation email open on his laptop. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He thought of his father's words, of the years he had postponed himself, of the way the cafe felt warmer now, more alive, of the version of himself that had always waited for permission. He typed. When he finally pressed send, there was no dramatic relief, no surge of triumph, just a deep, steady breath. Later, lying in bed, Eli realized something unexpected. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted from fear of losing stability to fear of wasting what remained. And that fear, he knew, was worth listening to. Eli returned to the hospital 2 days later. The room felt quieter than before, though nothing about it had physically changed. The machines hummed softly, their rhythms steady and indifferent. His father lay still, eyes closed, breath shallow but present. Mara stood near the window, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "He's been sleeping most of the day," she said, "but he asked for you earlier." Eli sat beside the bed and took his father's hand. "I'm here," he said quietly. His father's eyes opened slowly. They searched for Eli's face, then softened when they found it. "You look lighter," he whispered. Eli smiled faintly. "I made a decision." His father nodded, as if he had already known. "Good," he said, "whatever it was." They didn't talk long. Words felt unnecessary now. Presence was enough. That evening Eli walked home alone. The city lights flickered on one by one, streets filling with ordinary life people, carrying groceries, laughing softly, arguing, living. He realized how close he had come to drifting through it all without ever fully stepping inside. At his apartment, he packed a box. Not everything, just the things that no longer felt like him. Old paperwork, clothes he wore out of habit, objects that belonged to a version of his life built on expectation rather than intention. When Claire called later, he answered immediately. "I quit," he said. There was a pause. Then, "How do you feel?" "Terrified," he admitted. "And honest." She laughed softly. "That sounds right." They met the next morning at the cafe for the last time, not because it was ending, but because something else was beginning. Claire stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "I'm leaving," she said. "I got an offer. Editing work. Remote. I'll be traveling for a while." Eli absorbed this quietly. "I didn't want to disappear without telling you," she added. He nodded. "I'm glad you told me." They didn't make promises. They didn't pretend distance was easy or a connection was guaranteed. Instead, they spoke carefully, truthfully. "I don't know what this is," Eli said. "Neither do I," Claire replied. "But I know it mattered." When they hugged goodbye, it was brief but sincere, the kind of closeness that didn't need certainty to be real. A week later, Eli's father passed away. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of ending that left space for grief without shock. At the funeral, Eli stood beside Mara, holding her hand as they listened to familiar words spoken in unfamiliar tones. He felt the weight of loss settle into him, not crushing, but permanent. That night, alone again, Eli sat by the window and wrote. Not for an audience, not for clarity, just to remember. He wrote about waiting, about fear disguised as safety, about a cafe that had felt like a pause in time, about a conversation that had shifted something inside him without demanding anything in return. Months passed. Eli took contract work, less money, more space. He learned to sit with uncertainty instead of running from it. Some days were heavy, others, surprisingly, Late occasionai messages arrived from Claire. Photos of unfamiliar streets. Short notes. Honest silences between them. No promises. No regret. One evening, Ely returned to the cafe. The table by the window was occupied by someone else now. He ordered coffee anyway and sat alone, watching the city breathe beyond the glass. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was waiting. He felt present. Life hadn't become easier, but it had become his. And that, he understood now, was the only kind of healing that lasted.